If I can call you to order, please. Thank you for coming back after lunch. And thank you for that extraordinary thing that happened out there where we all endorsed the communique. We now come to the point where we start to take the products of our work, both here and in the 18 months that have gone beforehand, and take them to the outside world, and in particular to communicate that to the G20. So this afternoon is a slightly different format to the sessions that we've had over the past couple of days, but it continues very much on the same themes. And I'm delighted that for this afternoon, and I'll introduce you properly in a minute, but we're joined by His Excellency, the Deputy Prime Minister, Cevdet Yilmaz, by the G20 Sherpa, Ambassador, and forgive me, my Vietnamese pronunciation is excellent because I live there, but my Turkish pronunciation is poor. But we're also joined by Sherpa Ambassador Aisha Senyor-Leono, and of the former Deputy Prime Minister Ali Babacan, who's been very closely involved with the G20 process. I'll introduce you properly later, but I did want to say thank you for coming on behalf of all of us, and welcome. So if we can... So I'll just talk through briefly what's going to happen this afternoon. In just 1 minute, we will have our keynote speech, which will take probably about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a time for Q&A. Then we'll go in immediately into a panel with our distinguished guests who are waiting patiently over there. We'll come up onto the stage, and we will have a session where we'll look at the different elements of the work that we've been doing in our communique will be responded to by these experts over there. Then we will have a short break, and then we will come back and have opportunity to interact and hear from the leadership of the Turkish presidency, who are responsible for everything that happens in the G20 this year. And that in itself is an exceptional opportunity that has not taken place in previous Civil 20 processes. So we're very grateful that you're here, and we're particularly looking forward to that session, which will take place towards the end of the afternoon. And then we will finally round it off with a closing ceremony sometime around 5:30 or 6 o'clock. So that's the flow, that's what's going to happen. So without further ado, and I've got to say thank you for your patience, I'd like to introduce Professor Daron Acemoğlu. Professor Acemoğlu is the Killian Professor of Economics at MIT and is among the 10 most cited economists in the world. And I think he's probably perhaps best known to the layman for his book, Why Nations Fail, which rather worryingly, an automated email from Amazon this morning suggested I might like to buy, which is not worrying. It's worrying because I bought it already when it was published, but it's more worrying because Amazon obviously knows more about what I'm doing today than maybe I do, but that's a different topic. In 2005, Professor Acemoğlu received the John Bates Clark Medal, awarded to economists under 40, judged to have made the most significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. He's a member of the Economic Growth Program of the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research. He's affiliated with the National Bureau of Economic Research, with the Centre for Economic Policy Research, and many other prominent institutions. He's also the co-editor of Econometrica, the Review of Economics and Statistics, and a number of other publications. And he's been a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2006, since 2006. So we are delighted that you're here with us to share some thoughts about democracy, civil society, and economic growth. I'd like to give you the floor, and I've heard that you are both inspiring but also concise. So we're looking forward to some real nuggets from you and then to engaging the audience as well. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll see about both concise and insightful. So I'm going to talk about democracy, civil society, and economic growth. Democracy has many foes and critics, from Aristotle to Plato to Montesquieu, from James Madison and Alexander Hamilton of the US Constitution, yes, they were no big friends of democracy, to Xi Jinping today in China. Many people think that democracy is mob rule and has lots of problems. And in fact, there are good reasons for thinking so. Throughout ages, democracies have had certain problems. They can get into log jams. We know that democracies are perhaps more likely than other regimes sometimes to get into populist policies. And there are potentially lots of other problems with democracies. For example, intellectual, social, political, economic elites generally don't like democracy because it disempowers them. It entrusts, for example, decision-making to regular people rather than, elites like ourselves, graduates of, elite universities such as Bosphorus University or all of you coming from all around the world. And lately, there are lots of reasons to think that perhaps non-democracies are better at dealing with lots of economic problems. China is still growing at a breakneck speed, even with their current problems. And democracies sometimes look at Chinese top-down policies admiringly. Wasn't it the case that China was much more effective in the financial crisis because it could allocate resources in the way that it wanted? And in academia, too, there is increasing sort of concern about lots of inefficiencies of democracy. In fact, a sort of consensus has emerged among certain policy circles, journalists, public intellectuals, that democracy is something we like, but we like it despite its costs in terms of economic performance or efficiency of decision-making. So, the first thing I want to do is to dispel all of that. There are, indeed, potential theoretical reasons why democracy might have inefficiencies. And there are also potential theoretical reasons why democracy is superior in terms of its economic performance, or should be superior in terms of economic performance, to other non-democratic autocratic regimes. First of all, democracies, because they are not the rule of the elite, are going to be more willing to redistribute, especially to the more disadvantaged segments of society, which are often those starved of resources. Democracies might also be the ones more willing, rather than less willing, to undertake reforms, because often reforms are those that protect insiders. They protect monopolies connected with the government, they protect powerful interest groups, and it might be democracies rather than autocracies, military dictatorships, or tin pot regimes, perhaps, that would be better at undertaking such reforms. So it's really an empirical question. And even though there is some sort of a consensus, that consensus turns out to be not really built on much of an empirical evidence, except for haphazard comparisons, say, between China and India. But really, if we really want to understand whether democracy does well or not economically, comparing two countries that are so different from each other, and that are different both in terms of their existing level of economic growth, existing economic structure, which is going to create different abilities to converge and absorb technology from abroad, other institutional features, that's not going to be very informative. A much more informative and simple strategy is to actually look at countries that go in and out of democracy. So what happens to countries after they're democratized? What happens to the countries once they abandon democracy and go into dictatorship? So here is a graph. This is, oops, if it worked. It was working, oh yes, here it is. So this is just data. What it does is that it takes every country and compares them to non-democratic countries. Sorry, this doesn't compare. So this just looks at change in GDP per capita, so a very simple measure of economic performance. and looks at it around years of democratization. Comparison to autocracies is in the background so that you're actually taking out general global time trends. So you can see two things here that are quite apparent. The first one is that countries don't actually democratize when things are going well. On average, countries democratize, this is the year zero of democratization, they democratize when things are going badly. So it's not the general rule, contrary to what some other social philosophers and social scientists have claimed, that democracy is something that's brought like luxury goods by a modernization process, that once we become rich, we are more willing to adopt democracy. In fact, it is the destabilization of existing non-democratic regimes during economic crises that is much more likely to bring democracy. The other thing is that once a country democratizes, of course, immediately not much happens, perhaps, but in about 5-10 years' time, democracies start growing, and they grow about 25 percentage points more, or they achieve a level of GDP per capita 25% greater than what they would have done without that sort of democratization. Now, this is just raw data. There are lots of things that you might want to worry about, including all of those dynamics of convergence, the fact that countries that democratize don't have the same sort of past economic performance, and so on and so forth. So here it is when you control for all of these. So now when you control for all of these, you see that there is no previous trend in democratizers. So it's not like countries that are democratizing are very different from others once you could do these controls, but the overall pattern is the same, especially after 10 years. The extra growth performance of democracy of about 25 to 30% is pretty clear and striking. Those bands here are the standard error bands. So why does democracy do that? Why is it that democracies are actually more successful than other countries? Well, it turns out that it's pretty much for the two reasons that I have indicated. First, democracies do redistribute precisely to the less advantaged people in society that would not have gotten that sort of redistribution otherwise. So I can show you different sort of measures for that, but one of them is this: infant mortality. Same thing. This is year zero around democratization. When before you democratize, there is no obvious previous trend, so it doesn't look like something was going on, and it is precisely the countries that were already on a good health path that democratize or otherwise. But once they democratize, there is a huge improvement in child mortality. Second, it is precisely because democracies are actually better at doing reform. Exactly the opposite of what sometimes people claim. Democracies get into log jams, and the democratic processes is not very good at making hard decisions, and so on and so forth. So here is an index of a broad measure of market reforms: labor market reforms, product market reforms, financial reforms, opening of various things against monopolies or against other sort of market restricting activities. Again, not much before a democratization. In a few years, already 1 year after democratization, you have a big improvement in those market reforms. So I think, of course, in social science, nothing is definite, but this is as strong evidence as you can find for anything that's generally well measured. We have a bunch of evidence for other things at the micro level, but at macro level, I think this level of clear evidence, and everything I'm showing you here is fairly robust, so it's not that I'm cherry picking what I'm showing you to make a good case for democracy. This is actually speaking quite loudly. But in fact, democracy itself is not sufficient. And you might say, well, you're showing us something that looks impressive on the screen, but if you look at the numbers, 25%, Turkey is not going to become Germany with just democracy versus non-democracy. That gap is much larger. Vietnam is not going to become, South Korea with just democracy. And there's a good reason for that, because democracy is actually rather a small part of a bigger institutional bundle. And that institutional bundle, democracy is a key part of it, key sort of foundation of that institutional bundle, but it is in itself interpreted in the way that we generally interpret it and the way that is actually measured in the data that I'm showing, which is free and fair elections. And parties can compete and whoever gets elected doesn't get...
Partiler rekabet içinde olabilir ve seçilen de ondan sonra başka askerler tarafından vesaire devrilmez. Fakat örneğin neden uluslar başarısız oluyor adlı kitabımızda
which we define as inclusive political institutions. And in inclusive political institutions, we put a number of elements. And in these elements, a crucial one is that political voice and political power is fairly equally distributed in society. So that means democracy. So if you don't have democracy at a minimum, you're never going to have these politically inclusive institutions. Because if you don't have democracy, you're going to have a junta, you're going to have a one-person rule, you're going to have a monarchy or some other autocratic regime, and that's definitely not consistent with a broad distribution of political power. But democracy does not guarantee a broad distribution of political power. You can have a one-party democracy, effectively de facto or in fact de jure. That will be very far from inclusive political institutions as we defined it. But even more than that, inclusive political institutions, which are going to be even more important for bringing you these sorts of goodies that I showed, public goods for the less well-off in society, market reforms, a secure environment for people to be innovative, or opportunities to be equally distributed in societies. You require that other institutional guarantees and other social guarantees for that equal distribution of political power are actually there. And these include, first, an institutional leg. You need things such as separation of powers. So Montesquieu on this one was on the money. He was no big friend of democracy, but he was on the money when it came to understanding what republics need. And you need an independent judiciary so that the politicians don't run amok. They often have a tendency to do so. You need other institutional guarantees so that power in reality or in hidden ways doesn't get concentrated in the hands of a small segment of society. That's the first set of institutional prerequisites for a politically inclusive set of institutions. But the second one is equally important. One other key idea that James and I discussed in Why Nations Fail is that you cannot generally trust elites. Whoever sits atop of any edifice is going to have an incentive to start using that for its own incentives, for its own benefits. So we are used to reading history through the lenses of winners, of big men. We are used to thinking about how the important role of intellectual elites are. But if you look at history, at least through the lenses that we have tried to develop, many positive movements don't come from the elites who suddenly say, oh, well, you know, I am so powerful, so much well-off, but I want to distribute all that power to other people. No, it doesn't happen that way. It happens because there are demands from the bottom. People are loud and unruly and demand things. That's how the American Revolution happened. That's how the Glorious Revolution happened. That's how the English Revolution happened. That's how democratization in Britain happened. And even once you have democracy, even once you have inclusive political institutions, those things are not going to stay around forever unless they are defended. In the same way that elites, when they have power, are going to be unwilling to distribute that and relinquish that, when they don't have that power as much in their hands, they're going to be willing to make investments and back deals in order to grab more of it. So every democracy gets threatened every now and then. Every politically inclusive set of institutions starts being chipped at by this group or that group. So democracy, politically inclusive institutions, they need to be defended. Who is going to defend them? That's civil society. So civil society is an integral part of this story, together with media, free media, because it is only from the protection of civil society, from the protection of media, that's going to be rambunctious, and that's going to be loud, that's going to be aggressive sometimes, that we can expect those politically inclusive institutions to survive. Why? Because again, you cannot just let it for the goodwill of the elites, goodwill of the politicians, goodwill of presidents, prime ministers, business elites. No. So the story is one in which democracy is part of an ensemble. It's a crucial part of an ensemble. And as I showed you, it actually has, contrary to what many people believe, fairly clear economic benefits. But it also is fragile, and it's also insufficient. So we need bigger institutional checks, and we need civil society to defend it. You know, we are sitting here in Turkey, which has experienced many of these things. It has experienced years of military rule, weakness of democracy, strengthening of democracy. But I think what Turkey has not experienced is actually a strong, self-confident civil society or a free media. And I think that is the reason why Turkish democracy has never found its true calling, because I think it is impossible for democracy to come into its true fruition unless those supporting actors are present. Sometimes things go well. Sometimes you can see quite rapid improvements. So one thing that these figures show is that when you actually have democracy and when you have the market reforms, things can improve very rapidly. Well, Turkey actually shows that. You know, after years of very fragile growth, you have a big, rapid improvement in economic conditions. When the same sort of market reforms that I'm showing you much more generally for 150 countries were happening here, and they were happening in a country that was becoming more democratic. So exactly the same story. But then, what's going on here? Nothing much. So if you look at it, if you compare the first 5 years, 2000 to 2006, you have high growth, low current account deficit, high productivity growth, high manufacturing growth. And if you look at the 2007, 2014, the next 8 years, you have lower growth, much more dependent on current account deficits, much more dependent on government spending, much less productivity growth, really zero. And why is that? Well, it is because exactly like that big picture that I showed you for the cross-country, Turkey, when it found its democratic wings for a while, it did a lot of market reform. So this is just from the World Bank. This doesn't cover all the post-crisis, and I think it's a little bit kind to Turkey for what happened in the post-crisis. But if you look at pre-crisis, control of corruption, huge improvements, government effectiveness, regulation quality, rule of law, voice and accountability, doing business. And all of those either stop improving or actually start going bad. Corruption, there are huge improvements in the corruption perception in Turkey in the first few years after 2000. There are actually good regulations, some of them imposed on us thanks to World Bank. But they stopped being implemented. So corruption perceptions improve, and then they start deteriorating. Improve, and they start deteriorating. And part of this is that the general environment of civil society starts deteriorating in Turkey. This is media freedom in Turkey. From around 2007, the same year that I was picking on as the start of low quality growth, you see a steady deterioration in media freedom. Turkey is a democracy. Everything is decided by electoral decisions. No doubt about that. But as I said, democracy isn't enough. Democracy needs its supporting institutions, and if it doesn't get the supporting institutions, it's not going to do the right market reforms, it's not going to do the right decisions, and it can even veer out of control. So civil society, with its muscle, with its voice, with its self-confidence, with its ability to act outside the rules if necessary, is really crucial for all democracies, for all societies that are aspiring to be democracies, and for democracies that are aspiring to do better, like Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. You've kindly agreed to take some questions. Professor Acemoğlu has kindly agreed to take some questions. So we'll collect 2 or 3, and then maybe you can then respond. You're welcome to stand there, or you're also welcome to have a seat if you like.
I'll stand here.
So there's one over here. If we can get the mic, please. There's one over here. If you can put up your hand now, if anybody else would like to ask one. Yep, okay, so first question here is here, and then here. Yeah, please go. If you can stand up and introduce yourself, that would be good.
Ayşegül Ekmekçi from Oxfam in Turkey. Professor, thank you so much for the inspiring talk. I just have one question. When you were collecting the data on, giving, providing us your comments on democracies and non-democracies and the correlation between economic growth and democracies, what are the indicators that you use to determine whether a country is moving away from a democracy or, the other way around? I was just wondering what kind of indicators you use for that.
Great. Thank you. Then we had a question here, I think, and then we'll come to the front. Maybe if you can use the mic, that would be great.
Tekrar merhaba, Perihan Çakıroğlu. Ben Daron Acemoğlu'nu birçok kez dinledim. Gerçekten takdir ettiğim bir ekonomist ve uzman. Demokrasiyle ekonomiyi de ilişkilendirme açısından.
The relationship between democracy and economy. I would like to ask him the following because it is very actual. To Professor Daron, at this point, while going to the elections, you gave some hints, but I would like to know the following. You said that at one point Turkey lived a lot of things, democracy, but Turkey never had freedom of media, and the NGOs who didn't make them voice heard. I must say that nowadays we have quite a pessimistic atmosphere, and everybody is a little bit sad, if I don't exaggerate. Soruyu kısa tutar mısınız lütfen? And the 1st of November there will be elections. What do you think about those elections, you coming from abroad, from the point of view of democracy and economy? Teşekkür ederim.
Sherpa. This year, especially within the G20, we put the inclusive growth at the heart of the G20. You established a very close link between economic growth and democracy. I have a question because I think this is very important. I can give you just one figure, within the OECD, inequality has been rising, and it is at its highest level in last 30 years. Does this mean, especially in developed countries, can we draw on from your speech that the institutional, let's say, inclusive institutional have been failing in developed countries because there is a lack of democracy and the economic growth is very moderate, it is very fragile? Can we go that way? Thank you.
Thank you. So if you'd like to respond to those 3 briefly, if that's possible, and then we can take just another round of a couple.
Okay, let me first say one word about the index. Actually, that picture I was going to, but doesn't matter. You know, there are many indices for democracy. They measure somewhat different things. You know, for the one that comes closest to the definition that I gave is the Freedom Houses Index, which really measures what is called the Schumpeterian definition of democracy: free and fair elections. Are people able to participate in the election? Is the electoral outcome implemented? There is the Polity data set, which measures a little bit of broader things, which includes some degree of political rights in addition to just pure democracy. There are a couple of other indices. Now, the problem with many of these indices is that they're very noisy, and they have many, many fine degradations. But if you look at the fine degradations, they don't really mean all that much. So what we do is that we actually take all of these indices, we go to primary sources, and we code a variable that's 0, 1, which turns out to be the one that has the most information. And that's the evidence that I showed you with the 0, 1 measure. The results are more or less the same, but they become a little bit less clear, less clean when you have these finer degradations, because a lot of that is measurement error, essentially. On inequality, I think that's a very, very interesting topic. I have that's a very common view, is that increasing inequality is a deep failure in economic institutions, a deep failure in democracy. I have a slightly more, I have a more nuanced view of the increase in inequality, in the sense that I think inequality is potentially an important issue, but we do get a little bit too obsessed with inequality. You know, inequality, if you look at movements in inequality, sometimes they really are very much related to what's going on at the bottom of the distribution. And then they're really very much related to what I was talking about, which is lack of public services and lack of advantage, lack of opportunity for the bottom 30, 40, 50, 60% of the population. And then it becomes really extremely dangerous, and it's extremely extractive instead of inclusive in our terminology. But it can also happen in other ways. For instance, people decry a lot of what's going on in the top 1%. But if you look at the increase in top 1%, sometimes that can go hand in hand with, the bottom of the distribution does very well. So we really need to look into a little bit more what's going on with inequality. So if you look at, for example, Finland, Sweden, Norway today, there is a fairly large increase in the top 1% inequality, but the bottom of the distribution is doing extremely well. And the very important element that one should look at, what's going on to social mobility in these societies? And if you look at social mobility, you can't quite look at it in Norway or Sweden because with this very detailed data with the recent, but you can look at it in the US. There is no evidence that social mobility is declining in places where inequality is increasing. So why is that? Well, I think part of it is that because many of these countries, especially Sweden, especially Norway, to some degree US, but with very, very important caveats, have the right sort of public education institutions and other supporting institutions that ensure that people who are at the bottom of the distribution are still benefiting from education, from opportunities. But in the US especially, perhaps to some degree in the UK, there are also big failings. People can go without health insurance, people can fall into the margins of society, and that is probably more likely to happen in high inequality societies. But I think the biggest danger that high inequality poses, and again we're seeing some dangerous trends here, and I think that's the one that I would really single out when it comes to are we moving in a non-inclusive direction, is that once you have an increase in inequality in the economic dimension, you also have an increase in inequality in the political dimension. The very rich start talking more loudly, the more marginalized, economically marginalized become politically marginalized, and you're seeing a little bit of that in the United States. And if that happens, if that starts to happen, that's trouble, and that really can shake the foundations of a more otherwise inclusive system. So in other words, I think inequality is a problem that we have to watch out, but we really have to watch it out in the context of a broader set of institutional arrangements. And then coming back to the one other part of the questions that you were asking, which is the increase in inequality a failure of inclusivity? Yes and no, but generally no, in the sense that if you look at the causes of inequality, and people, there's some disagreement on this, but the data are generally quite clear, is that a lot of the increase in inequality is because of technological and global factors. it is being exacerbated because of other things that are going on. Low quality public education in some places, some political deals and rent seeking at the top, but the overwhelming force for greater inequality is economic. That doesn't mean that it is benign, but it means that the way to fight it is not trying to interfere with the market system. The way to fight it is to invest more in education, to invest more in healthcare, to invest more in infrastructure, to invest more in things that are going to enable people at the bottom who in some of these communities, especially in the US, for example, are really becoming somewhat more marginalized, not to become more marginalized. So I think inequality brings sometimes the more ideological elements in the debate, and people start disagreeing. But you know, I think evidence is again sort of very useful, and I don't have that with me. But there is a lot of evidence that the inequality trends are a little bit more nuanced than just the increase in inequalities because the system is becoming less inclusive. On the elections, let me not say much on the elections because my point here is not to sort of advocate one thing or another. The only thing I want to say is that, you know, what I try to show is that Turkey's democracy needs deepening. Turkey's democracy needs greater freedom, more active civil society, and I think that's what I hope to see in the elections and in its aftermath.
Thank you very much. We can take just two very short questions. There's one at the back and one over there. So there's one right at the back and then one in the red shirt, and then that's it, I'm afraid. Sorry. Nice and short, please.
Sure. Thanks for coming and joining and being a part of this conference. One of the work streams we've been discussing is taxation. I was curious about your perspective on how taxation can be a powerful tool to not only redistribute wealth, but also to fund development purposes. But you just stated that, you know, the market shouldn't be disrupted, and a part of a role of taxation is to regulate as well. So could you elaborate on that and clarify your position?
Thank you.
Right, thank you. And then there was one question over here in the red at the back. At the back, yeah. If you can stand and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Akash Maharaj from the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. My question is, if you feel that there is a strong correlation between democracy on the one hand and economic growth on the other, given that many of the countries who are members of the G20 are, to put it charitably, at different stages of democratic development, do you think that it should be a responsibility of the G20 to foster democracy amongst less democratic countries? And also, if you feel that economic crisis tends to drive countries towards democracy more than prosperity, is it in the long term a mistake for the G20 to seek to enrich countries who are not democracies?
Thank you. So if we can brief response to those two questions.
Thank you very much for that question, because I was trying to rush and I did not give it a complete answer. So absolutely, I did not mean to put, definitely not, taxation in the category of intervention in the functioning of the market. Taxation is a crucial part of any market economy, and taxation is necessary for financing public services, and I think any taxation in a society that is prosperous, or even that it's not prosperous, but especially one in which inequality is increasing to such high level, has to be progressive. So there is a great need for progressive taxation, and the proceeds of that taxation have to be spent for the things that I have already mentioned, which are becoming more and more necessary. If you look at the OECD countries, the level of taxation is generally quite high, but probably there are many of them, from Spain to the United States, that need more hire Turkey, that need higher level of taxes, and to some degree these should come from more progressive taxes, but also to the extent that it's possible, not just indirect taxation like we have in Turkey, for example, not just income taxes that can be evaded or avoided as in the United States, but broader base and greater taxation. When I was talking as the market functioning should not be you should try to deal with the enabling part of it to deal with inequality. I was talking of the governments directly trying to strengthen unions or trying to interfere with what wages are set in one setting or another. So those things, of course, unions also have an important role. They should do their own negotiations, but from the top, interventions with the price mechanisms are the things that really worry me. But the government has a crucial role in part of the taxation as well as the provision of the public services. I think those have to be very, very important part of it. And let me say, I know Steve asked me to be brief, but let me say one other very important thing, which is this sort of opens the way. I think one crucial problem across countries around the world is the inability of the government to tax. Governments are not very effective. They're not really able to penetrate society. They're not able to have the efficient bureaucracies, and for that reason, either they don't tax. If you look at tax rates, for example, tax revenues in South Asia, Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, they are pitifully low, and any taxes that they can raise come from indirect sources, which are much more distortionary. The same to some degree is true in Turkey, where the taxes are very unbalanced. So that's really related to government effectiveness and the other democratic things that I was talking about. And that's a very important part of being able to distribute this wealth in an inclusive manner, dealing with the most pernicious effects of inequality. So those are absolutely very, very important. So I definitely did not mean to sort of imply that at all. I was just talking of, some of the ideas that get floated about the government directly interfering because that's the way to deal with inequality. I think those are the ones that I find very, very troubling. In terms of the different levels of democracy, I think that's a very good question, and it is, as this chart shows, do countries democratize in the middle of economic crises, because that destabilizes non-democratic regimes. It wakes people up to the reality that there is need for something else. But how do you deal with other countries' internal problems? I think we know from bitter experience that assuming that you can deal with countries' internal problems and help them democratize with interventions from outside really don't work. And I don't just mean Iraq. I mean from Somalia to Afghanistan. All of these interventions that really don't take into account the ineffectiveness of the government, the fragmented nature of society from the outside are not going to be very effective. But on the other hand, we also have examples from the EU, especially with Eastern Europe, but also EU with Turkey, that carrot and stick strategies also do work. Prodding, helping them with advice, and sort of promising closer associations linked to political progress are often useful. But I think the more important element here is that, when you are dealing with countries that are blatantly non-democratic, you have to take that into account. You have to, for example, make a concerted effort to bring opposition groups that are silence in that society to the table. You have to make an effort to work with civil society organizations such as they are, non-governmental organizations, rather than, to say, well, this country is poor, it needs resources, the only standing thing is the government, let's channel everything to the government. So I think that's very important. It's not a major issue within the OECD, but once you go beyond the OECD, once you go to beyond the 20, to the world of the really poor countries, that's a really first order concern. Okay, thank you very much.